Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski. I have a little bit of a scratchy voice tonight. I apologize, but please bear with me because I got a really cool program for us tonight with my colleagues Phil Greenwalt and Pat Kelly-Fischer. Good evening, fellas.
Howdy, Chris. How's it
Good
going?
evening.
And I've invited you guys on tonight because you have a new book out. And for Phil, this is like book like 600 for you. But like Pat, this is brand new book number one for you. So it's called Desert Empire, the 1862 New Mexico campaign. Congratulations, guys.
Thank you. It's
Thanks.
exciting to see it coming into fruition.
Uh,
Just
so,
trying to catch up with you, Chris. Uh,
well, let's start with you, Pat, because this is your first book. How does it feel to have your name in print?
I am excited to see the physical copy arrive. We're recording this before it is in our hands. Um, it's, we've been working on this for what, Phil, like 3 years now, and
yeah.
it's really exciting. It's not something I ever thought I would do until Phil said, "Hey, man, let's write a book about this." Fast forward, and here we are.
Yeah, and there is, as you mentioned, kind of a time lapse, a little different than our production process for the Emerging Civil War series has changed, where we used to kind of have instant books. So there is that time lapse. Is it a little bit of surreal to kind of go from having written it to this quiet time to now suddenly finding it in production?
For me, I don't even know what normal is or what it was like. So this is just, I don't know what I expect. I didn't have expectations coming in, I guess.
Okay.
But it's been interesting as we've gotten closer to the finish line here, going back and refreshing myself. And it's like, oh yeah, we wrote about that. A little bit of that feeling of, oh, this is pretty good. Who wrote this as you're looking back? So hopefully people reading it for the first time think the same thing.
I've had that experience where I've read a book and it's like, oh, this is actually pretty good. Oh, wait, I wrote this and have no real memory of having written it, but it's like, oh, I'm glad it has held up. Phil, this is one of two books that you're going to be having out this spring. You've got Desert Empire, and then later on you'll have A Hard Bought Victory about the Battle of Bunker Hill, co-written with Dan Davis. How you feeling?
It's a deer ball victory.
A deer bot. Did I say hard bot? Yeah, deer bot
Yeah.
victory. I should know. I made such a fuss over the hyphen in the title. Uh, how does it feel to you to have another book coming out?
It's uh I mean overall it's kind of cool because I kind of bookended it. Dan Davis and I have written multiple books. We were together, so we were joking that this time we're writing about redcoats and rebels, not Confederates and Yankees. So we had to make sure we had the terminology down. I mean, Pat, it was awesome because he's obviously very articulate, a very great writer. Asked the questions that I wish I would have asked as a first time author. Um, but it's kind of interesting, especially as you're trying to focus so much on America's 250th and the Revolutionary War going on, is to then separate and head to the Southwest and everything, and see that the countries that some of these gentlemen are starting to create is now breaking apart in your second other book. And it's also the fun of and anyone that served in the military or around the military understands the hurry up and wait type thing. And I think that's what you learn through these books is that there are things you need or things that have to happen right now and things that you need to wait on. But the hardest part was not trying to find too many new things to keep adding to the editor. Be like, oh, I just read this, or oh, because like scholarships keep coming out and more things are getting digitized, and so it was like, okay, sometimes it's what you don't put in instead of what you do put in.
Yeah, yeah, that process of culling your information but it is exciting, you get a manuscript done and then you find something later and it's like, oh wait, I got to find a way to kind of work this in and it's neat to kind of keep fresh like that. Phil, let me ask you first and then we'll have Pat tell his side of the story. But since Phil said, hey, let's write a book. Phil, tell me, where did the idea for this book come from?
So I've always some call me a homer for Baltimore or Maryland or spent time in Florida. I've always been interested in like the fringes, as I call it, of the Civil War, like the ones that are outside that narrow focus. And it kind of came across because I had was headed out west visiting an old friend I worked with in the National Park Service that had moved to Arizona, and then kind of was told about Fort Union from another contact in the National Park Service, and then it kind of just spiraled from there. I went to Pecos and couldn't excuse me, Pecos National Historical Park, and then that's where Glorieta Pass is kind of managed out of or preserved, and just realized that how much was out there. You keep going through these little towns, and like it was almost like discovering something new. Like Valverde, part of it is if you have a high clearance vehicle, you can still access, and they were still finding stuff out in the middle of the desert. And then just driving, I remember trying to get, I dragged my sister and brother out there. They wanted to go on a family trip. And I said, well, I'm doing history. So they were silly enough to join along. And I remember trying to drive from like Santa Fe to Wasilla and then into El Paso and realizing how long it took. And we couldn't even find coffee. And then thinking these guys marched that way. And so it just came out of that and everything, realizing that there wasn't much out there to get people introduced. And I had to find a lot of things on ourselves. And then I think Pat reached out after I gave a talk on the what ifs at one of the ECW symposiums. And then it kind of just spiraled. I was like, hey, you want to join this project? Because I like to say I'm not lazy, but I knew it'd be fun to co-author because you can bounce good stories off each other and everything. And so, but I did not realize at the time that he was a Steelers fan. Otherwise, that might have changed the whole dynamic. So he kept that one hidden. He had a good poker face. So
We take our football very seriously at ECW.
yeah,
I'll invite listeners to dip way back into the podcast archives because after Phil took that trip to the Southwest, he did come onto the podcast and talk a little bit about some of those things that he found on his explorations out there. So, Pat, how did you get wrangled into this project and what makes this story so exciting for you?
So the one of the very first posts I wrote when I joined Emerging Civil War, I guess still as a guest writer, was about the Battle of Valverde. And I think that was, what maybe originally prompted Phil and I to connect with each other because we had this shared interest. Uh, I want to highlight what Phil was saying about being interested in those kind of forgotten campaigns, the hidden edges of the war. The thing I kind of miss about when I first started studying the Civil War is that page-turning feeling of what's going to happen next because you don't know. There's still, incredible books about Gettysburg and Antietam and Fredericksburg, but you go in knowing who wins and who loses. There's not that many surprises left if you studied the Civil War when it comes to the big battles. I'd wager 95% of people have never even heard of this campaign, let alone knowing who wins the Battle of Valverde, who wins at Glorieta, how does the campaign resolve? And so having the opportunity to give people that kind of, again, page turning, what happens next anticipation is something I was really excited about having the chance to do. And I think there's a big part of why I got interested in the campaign in the first place. It there's not that much written about it. This isn't the first book about it, but there's less written about this than virtually any other Civil War campaign because it's so remote and so small. And it really wasn't until the 50s that there was the very first published work about it. So it really flew under the radar for a very long time. And then I live out in Colorado. So as far as distances out west go, this kind of happened in my backyard. It's a 4 hour drive to get to Santa Fe, 6 hours to get to Valverde. A little less if I'm driving alone in the car instead of having my wife with me. But it to us, that's as close as it gets. That is the closest major Civil War site. Whereas, for y'all, living in Virginia and Maryland, I don't think you would call that your backyard
Yeah,
necessarily.
right, right. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, we were driving through northern New Mexico on a road trip. I saw a sign for Fort Union, which I'd never even heard of. This would have been 12, 13 years ago now. And I thought, oh, let's pull in there and check it out. And my wife begrudgingly agreed. And that was a big part of how I discovered, oh, all of this happened out here. And then just kept studying it from there.
Yeah. Yeah. So you and Phil teamed up. Was that exciting? Was it nervous? Did tell me about that partnership?
Well, it was a lot better until I learned he was a Ravens fan. And I've got to say, that was just, you think you know somebody, and then it turns out they just have a huge disappointing character flaw they surprise you with. Uh, no, it's been really great working with Phil. I don't want this to go to his head or anything, but he's been through this process so many times, just like Chris, you've been through this process, and so you were both really helpful in that regard. Whereas very first time for me, I had no idea what to expect going in. So bottomless question, endless questions from me in terms of what next, what do we expect, how many, everything from word count to photo count to style questions to everything in between. Um, and I feel like it really, I mean, I could not have done this alone. It never even would have occurred me to do this alone, honestly. So really, if it wasn't for Phill, this project wouldn't in a million years have wouldn't exist.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll take a quick stab. I just wanted a drinking buddy in Denver. No, it
That's what I did
actually
when I get out there too. Yeah.
yeah, it no, the process, I mean, is I think it bears fruit to what emerging Civil War was trying to do. Is we grew out of like a kernel around Fredericksburg, but then it like kind of the seeds kind of planted across the United States and so forth. And Pat's a great example of that and everything. And so it was just really awesome because it's the as you say, to become a good writer, you have to be a good reader. And Pat's style is completely different than I'd worked with Dan and Rob Orson, and their styles are completely different. But just being able to read and understand, okay, how do you mold these together, or learning something about how do you just put sentences. And so always like to try to stay humble enough to say I'm not the smartest in the room. And I know right now I'm the least in the top three on this chat right now, but it is something you learn everything you learn along the way and so forth. So it's really appreciative of just kind of expanding horizons and receptive that he answered that email, and that there was actually two people in emerging Civil War that had knew where New Mexico was and knew that it had Civil War history.
Well, and Pat, you talked about your goal of, kind of writing a page turner where people don't necessarily know the ending. And as I edited the book, I really loved the great story that you had to tell and the way that you told the story. And so for me, it was a wonderful opportunity to learn something new and to kind of get into the details a little bit. And so you achieved your goal. I think this is a really well told book. Really enjoy it from that perspective for sure. And of course, the history is super, super rock solid. For folks who don't know about the 62 campaign, and Pat, I'll toss this in your direction first because, it sort of centers on Colorado, even though we've got a lot of this action that's in New Mexico and even kind of spilling over into Arizona. What are the stakes in 1862 for this campaign, and why are they looking at being out there in the first place?
Good question. In some ways, to answer that, you have to go all the way back to the 1840s and remember that a lot of the tension that leads into the Civil War is about the debate over the expansion of slavery into the territories that we acquire after the Mexican War. And most of the Southwest, most of what we think of as the Mountain West and Southwest today, are part of the Mexican War cession. So we beat Mexico, we get a huge chunk of what is now the United States. And through the late 1840s and 1850s, a lot of future influential figures in the Confederate government are influential figures in the United States government. Folks like Jefferson Davis, who was Secretary of War and an influential senator at different times. And they're really looking at how can we take the institution of slavery and our influence as a region and expand it westward. It's purely an economic question for them at first in the 1850s. They end up feeling like they are hemmed in, and for any number of other reasons that we don't need to fully get into here, they, of course, secede and the Civil War breaks out. Anyone listening, this shouldn't surprise them so far. But they are already, to some degree, predisposed to think about how do we expand slavery west of Texas, getting a port out to the Pacific that was within the Southern sphere of influence was a long-standing goal, especially of Jefferson Davis. And then much more, just before the war breaks out, gold is discovered in Colorado. So you have gold in California, you have the potential for a port in California, and you have gold and silver in Colorado. So you're looking at huge potential for expanding slavery westward. You're looking at potentially new lands to grow cotton in, and you're looking at vast mineral wealth. And generally, this idea of just space to expand Southern influence and culture and then economic power. The other thing to remember is early 1861, no one really knows where that tide of secession is going to crest. Now, today we know what states seceded and what states didn't, and what border states were contested. But in that moment, anything feels like it's possible. You have a state, there's a window there in the secession winter. You have a state seceding what feels like every couple of days. Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri are all on the table. You even have New York City talking about seceding. And so you have these distant lands out to the west, and they're barely occupied by the US military. They're sparsely settled. They're mostly, in terms of white settlement, settled by transplants from further east, many of them southern, and no one has a concrete sense of what is Colorado's politics or New Mexico's politics or California's politics in that moment. And so they're all beginning to think about, is New Mexico on the table to revolt and secede? What will happen in Colorado? Even the governor of Colorado and the governor of California are both extremely concerned that their state and territory, respectively, could be next. At that point, California's a state, Colorado isn't. So, in the background of all that, you have a Texas Colonel, John Baylor, who takes a few hundred cavalry from West Texas and decides, let's see what happens if I ride into what was then the New Mexico territory. And that comprised what's today New Mexico and Arizona. And some of the residents of the southern portion of that region had already formed a secession convention and declared that they were now the seceded territory of Arizona and were seeking to join the Confederate government. So then this Texan, John Baylor, shows up with a few hundred cavalry and quickly routs and captures hundreds of US regulars who were occupying the region around Mesilla, which would be El Paso, Las Cruces area today. Fast forward a little bit, Henry Hopkins Sibley was quite the character. He had been serving in the territory, including at Fort Union, right up until he resigns his commission to join the Confederacy. He goes all the way out to Richmond, says, "Hey, old buddy, Jeff Davis, you've always cared about the West. I'm telling you, I was just out there. They're ripe to join us. We just have to send some troops out there. They'll flock to us." It's a theory you hear about Confederate offensives into Kentucky, into Maryland, this idea. We just have to get a presence there. They want us to come. They'll greet us as liberators. They'll sign up. They'll join. And so Sibley gets permission to raise about 3,000 cavalry. And the idea is he'll get into the New Mexico territory. He'll secure that, and it will pave the way to Colorado's gold mines and ports on the Pacific via California.
Phil, tell me about this desert empire idea. I mean, it's pretty radical.
It is. And it's almost unique because if you think about it, it's I think Megan Kate Nelson's book, The Three-Cornered War, is actually a very appropriate titled one. Sibley is serving, I mean, Fort Union is the largest actually hospital complex for the U.S. Army between Fort Riley, Kansas, and the West Coast. It has an armory there. It has supplies. Not only does Sibley serve there, but he actually keeps a record of it, and that's what he uses as part of his justification when he meets Jefferson Davis. Unfortunately, some of that conversation or what happened exactly um, has been lost to history, but basically, it's a win-win for the Confederates. You send this guy out here who knows something. He's going to raise the troops. He's just got the arms in Texas from of course, the Department of Texas being given over to the Confederacy or captured, and so then you invade, and you kind of upset this balance. It's kind of like the ripple effect. If he's able to get into New Mexico, keep New Mexico. If he's able to get into Colorado, and the gold that was found in 1860 is equivalent to the entire like War Department budget for the Confederacy in 1 year, so you can replenish it there. You're also unsure whether you can get into, say, like Utah, where the Mormons, who already have a rocky relationship with the federal government. Mormon War, what, the late 1840s, early 1850s, maybe gets to California and a Western port, or maybe upsets the Native American tribes that are there and seeing that these blue coats have left. And so this is a big, giant powder keg that Sibley is looking to attach on. Unfortunately, Sibley is a great mind. Obviously, he's a great inventor. He has a few patents, but his artillery commander, a guy named T.T. Teal, will actually say, that he never worried about tomorrow today. And that's probably not how you want to lead a campaign into what the Jornada del Muerto or the journey of death and so forth. And that's very his logistical capabilities are tested right away as the troops leave and have leave Central Texas and have to march in different at times because there's not enough water or supplies along the way just to get to the staging ground itself. Um, and then the last point I'll make is that he is ably served though by subordinates, and so it is a kind of a who's who of this Texas um, kind of gentleman officers or secessionists or military minds. And so it is a great reason why Don Alberts will call Glorieta the Gettysburg of the West, because it is the signifying event, even though it happens, what, almost a year and a half prior to the one that we well know that happens in southern Pennsylvania.
Yeah. Now, Phil, you mentioned the Tri-Cornered War, Megan Kate Nelson's a fantastic book, won the ECW Book Award a few years ago. And we've talked about the Confederates and the Federals. Tell us about just briefly the third corner in that war that you've mentioned, but why is that such an important, significant presence?
I actually have to say I pushed for Megan. I think was one of the people that voted for it, pushed it, told Neil that I would leave the book award committee if it wasn't considered. So I put my large size 14-foot down on that. It is. I mean, you have even so you have these Native American tribes, the Apaches, other ones, Navajos, and so forth, that suddenly realize there's an absence of blue-coated soldiers. They're also used to raiding across into Mexico, and so Sibley actually sends one of his regimental commanders to try to act as an emissary into these Mexican provinces. And I have been blessed with a lot of talents, but I cannot speak Spanish, so I'm not going to. I know one of them Sonora, and the other one I have no idea how to pronounce correctly. And so we'll leave it at that. But they know where the borders are, and the Confederates are worried about them going over. There's even instances where, like, as they raid into Arizona, there's a small contingent of Confederate soldiers raised out of Tucson. As they capture federal soldiers, they actually join up together when Native Americans attack them, and the federal soldiers give their word that they will return the guns as soon as the threat is over because they're all going to die. And so you see even like those ideas molding together. And then you have the New Mexican population who've been Spanish. They've been raided by the Texans. The federal forces come. One story that I found way too late was that three pro-Southerners walked into a town with New Mexico militia, said that they wanted the fort and they should surrender. The Mexican militia commander said, "Sure, it's not our fight." Handed them the keys, and when Sibley's men got there, they didn't know what to do because the fort had already been handed over. And so you have these amazing accounts, but you have these Native American tribes, you've got even the Mormons and other ones that are trying to figure out what is going on. And as these federal blue-coated soldiers leave these forts, you also see the retraction of populations as well because that protection is gone. And so obviously both sides will try to court some favor. Sibley has this right about trying to move through and not take the area of conquest. At least that's his message initially, even though he's trying to create this empire from sea to shining sea. I think that plays well because he is moving, has to move quickly. So initially that's the favor. But yeah, you have this kind of like powder keg being exploded, and then you lead into after the war, the wild, wild west, as they say.
And Pat, you talked about, kind of Sibley knowing the area, but it does seem like once he gets this campaign going, he doesn't apply the knowledge that he has to this. It seems like the environment is an kind of another combatant that we don't necessarily think of, but it's, I think, a great example of environmental history that Sibley does not seem well equipped to handle.
Yeah, it's a really interesting campaign. Phil started to touch on this when he mentioned the distances and just to stage from San Antonio to the El Paso, Mesilla, Las Cruces area. Just 3,000 cavalry. We're not talking Army of the Potomac numbers here. They're marching a day apart in three or four different groups because any one group is going to drain every watering hole dry. And then they have the added challenge of their entire force is mounted. So it's about 3,000 men. It's also about 3,000 horses you have to feed and water. And you're, again, going through very sparsely populated areas. So it's not like you can forage from the population. Um, I think there's probably a big difference here that he maybe underestimated between you have a pre-war cavalry company, you're out on an expedition against the Apaches and you have 100 guys with you. That is just wildly different than 3,000 men, 3,000 horses, all moving together. And you're trying to do that while ground is being contested by your opponent. He was expecting a lot more supplies to be built up by Baylor than were actually there and to be built up by Confederate sympathizers. So there's an air of he feels like they overpromised in terms of what he would be arriving to. And then it did very much bank on this idea of he could capture Fort Craig, which is the first major outpost, Union outpost, and then use that as a launching pad to get to Fort Union, and then use that as a launching pad to get up into Colorado's, where there's more forts, and then you also have the growing city of Denver and some smaller cities that wouldn't be household names now. But the idea was very much it's a self-sustaining campaign, and if you could keep that momentum going, getting into much friendlier climate. New Mexico is basically all desert. He has the Rio Grande, but even the Rio Grande is not in the dry season. It's barely a river, to be honest. And then if the Union Army is contesting that in any way and you can't go use the Rio Grande for water, you're really in trouble at that point. And one really constant theme throughout accounts on both sides, but especially the Confederate accounts, are thirst, hunger, and then complaining about the extreme weather. You have extreme heat in the height of the day, but then at night, the desert gets absolutely frigid. And these guys campaign outside from, probably 6 months total, virtually no opportunity to go indoors. It's a level of exposure that very, very, very few soldiers, even in the Civil War, would have experienced.
And Phil, let me ask you, as someone who went out to kind of explore and you're like, oh my gosh, you're an Easterner like I am. When people think of the desert, maybe they think of just like sand and Sahara. But what did you see about the desert when you were out there exploring? What's the desert in the Southwest like?
I mean, I really feel like I hit it when I got to Fort Craig and I had tumbleweed come up to the car. So now I realized I was really in it. But I mean, you're looking at from those temperatures of like a typical desert to like the sands and rock outcroppings to mountains that got snow up it to the northeast of like Santa Fe or Albuquerque. And so you have this differing kind of terrain that's very dry and arid. I almost reminisce thinking it was like putting your head in the oven during the day and then taking your head out of the oven and turning it off at night. And so that was how I felt. And then just walking part of the edge of Valverde um, was just a kind of a weird experience. Space is different. I mean, taking 2 to 3 hours to drive between Albuquerque and just getting down into the Fort Craig area. You figure 2 to 3 hours. If there's no traffic, you can go from Antietam to Fredericksburg and hit multiple battlefields along the way. Um, I was surprised that of course, you'll see the famous painting of them around Pigeon Ranch and so forth, the trees, the wooded area, and so forth. So the terrain of this really surprised me. And everyone has told me New Mexico is beautiful and it's not what you think it is. It's not what they showed on Looney Tunes where Bugs Bunny pops out of the hole in Albuquerque. And it's really, but you can, when you being an Easterner, you start seeing there's no amenities for X amount of miles. It kind of starts playing with your mind. It really puts you into that atmosphere of like there is distances and it is stretching. And I'm in a car that all you need is gas and make sure that the coolant is up. I'm not trying to feed and maintain a horse that also has a mind of its own and everything as well. Um, and I at least get to stay in a hotel that offered a continental breakfast every morning. So you could at least get out the next day and hike. But these guys are scavenging every day. And so, um, yeah, it just was a cool experience. I mean,
Yeah.
it's Civil War in such a beautiful surrounding, even made it more poignant, I guess.
Yeah, and you guys have both mentioned the heat and how arid it is. Not a lot of forage for those horses, and just much different kind of scrubby foliage than you find a lot in the east. Pat, we've talked a lot about the Confederate perspective. At the ECW symposium this summer, you'll actually be talking about the partnership and rivalry that exists from the Confederate side and the Union side. Tell us a little bit about the Union commander, Edward Canby, who's involved here.
So Edward Canby is a native Kentuckian. He was a regular Army officer. He's a colonel as of when the war breaks out, and he commands the Department of New Mexico, which covers more or less covers the entire scope of operations here. And he, going back to a point Phil raised about, the you have the native tribes. They don't view this as their fight. You have what was previously the Mexican population that's been part of the United States for a decade and change at this point. And Canby from day one says, we'll enlist however many regiments of them we can. And he has a set of local notables, including Kit Carson, the famous frontiersman, commanding those regiments and training those regiments. But he's running back to Washington right away saying, I need troops from the East. I need volunteers from the East. He does not trust locally raised troops, and there's a set of realpolitik reasons for that. There's also probably just a little bit of they don't speak English, they don't look like he does. It's a different era. Not trying to judge him for it, but a lot of it does come across as what we today would call racist in terms of not trusting Hispanic troops to fight for the Union cause. And so Washington, D.C. has way bigger fish to fry. They're definitely not sending him more regulars. They're actually telling him, you need to send all of your regulars east. We need them there. But what they are willing to do is get volunteer troops from Colorado, who are all white, and get them sent down into the New Mexico territory to help out Canby. And they end up being, in a lot of ways, along with the U.S. regulars in the territory, Coloradans end up being the backbone of the army that fights Sibley. They have one company that makes it as far as Valverde after a forced march, wading through the snow drifts to get down there. And they have a big impact on that battle in spite of being just one company. And then Glorieta, the Gettysburg of the West, is almost entirely Coloradans fighting along with a few companies of U.S. regulars. And that's really the force that ultimately drives Sibley back is Coloradans, almost entirely volunteers, almost none of them with previous military experience. And there is this tension of you have U.S. regulars who all have these pre-war ranks, so they'll have been in the army for decades and they're a captain or a major. And then you have volunteers who signed up yesterday, but one of them's already a colonel because someone had to get put in charge of the regiment. And so you have these guys who have no idea what they're doing. I mean, I'm sure they thought they did, but realistically, they have no experience and no training, but they're the volunteer colonel. And they outrank these regulars who have been serving in the New Mexico territory the entire time. And there's real tensions around that, including Gabriel Rene Paul is a high-ranking, by regular Army standards, officer at Fort Union. He is technically outranked by the colonel of the 1st Colorado Volunteers. They butt heads. Paul thinks that Colonel John Slough of Colorado, is being reckless and disobeying Canby's orders. Paul ultimately resigns in protest, much to Canby's frustration, because that was one of his right-hand guys. Paul ends up going east, he's like, fine, I'll be a volunteer officer. That seems to be the way to get ahead right now. Ultimately becomes a brigadier general, fights at Gettysburg, and is horrifically wounded on the first day's fighting. He's a brigade commander in the 1st Corps on July 1st.
He's wounded at the Glorieta Pass of the East, right?
That's the
He's
spirit.
blinded too, I think. I think the wound blinds him. It
Okay.
goes like through the back. Yeah. So it is. Grievous was the most understatement of the year, I think, right there. That is,
Yeah.
He lives with it for years. That is a It is one of the more horrifying wounds I've ever read about. I mean, that is just stuff that will give you nightmares.
Uh, you mentioned
I
John
tell you, but it would
Slough.
make this PG-13. I
Yeah.
tell you, but it'd be PG-13, so we need to
Uh,
keep it PG.
you mentioned John Slough. Just a previous episode of the podcast, we kind of pick up his story. Madeline Fierstein kind of talks about after his service in the Southwest, he comes to Alexandria, Virginia. So you can hear about that just a couple weeks ago in our podcast. Pat, there are also some Californians that are kind of involved in the campaign in an ancillary sort of way. Tell us a little bit about their involvement too.
Yeah, so the California is already a state when the war breaks out, unlike Colorado and New Mexico, which are still just territories. California is worried about two things. One is that Southern California already has some Southern sympathies and maybe some secessionist tendencies. Some of their leading politicians had called for closer ties to the South. They were known secessionists. And before the Civil War, there was actually a movement within California to break away the southern part of the state, which was very much viewed as pro-Southern, future pro-Confederate politicians trying to carve out their own little chunk of territory. And so the area around Los Angeles and San Diego today was viewed as a hotbed of secessionist sentiment. Um, there was a sense among California's leadership that there were thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Southern sympathizers just waiting for a spark to take up arms. Um, so they start raising volunteer units. And the idea is step one, put on a show of force in Southern California and dissuade these theoretical Confederate sympathizers from taking up arms. Just show the flag and some guns and some bayonets and hopefully keep things quiet. That succeeds. We'll never know how much were those overblown fears. Yeah, there probably weren't tens of thousands of Confederates just waiting to pick up a musket in Southern California at that point. But at the same time, I'm sure the fears weren't totally imagined either. The truth's probably somewhere in the middle. So they successfully preempt that rebellion from happening. But by that point, there's also word of Baylor and then Sibley's invasion. And there's no doubt in their minds that Sibley, when he's done with the Rio Grande Valley and Denver, is going to look to California next. And there's Confederate troops who make it as far as the modern day California border along the Yuma River. So they figure, why fight this fight in our own backyard when we could go fight them over there in New Mexico? So they send about 1,500 infantry across modern day Arizona, slowly pushing back the Confederates who had occupied it without too much of a fight. And the idea is they'll approach the Rio Grande Valley from the west, and Canby is defending it from the north, and they can capture Sibley between them. Turns out the Californians get there too late to do a whole lot, despite once they arrive, they really feel like they've missed out and really do make an effort to try and find a fight that they can pick. Uh, but it is this question of even if Sibley's campaign had turned out differently across Valverde, Glorieta, and what we cover in the heart of the book, then what would have happened when these Californians arrive? And one of my favorite things that really highlights how remote this campaign is and how poor communication is that when the California column starts to arrive, we still have these letters from Canby, who's in charge of the department, where scouts are telling him, hey, there's like 1,500 Californians coming from over here. And he's like, somebody would have told me if there was a whole other army on our side. You must be overreacting. You're imagining things. And then a couple of days later, he's like, no, this is real. Okay, we'll send you some food.
Well, and of course, the Californians do get involved in the battle at Picacho Pass. So they do claim the distinction of the furthest west action of the Civil War. So, they get that.
Well, furthest west land action, our
Yeah,
naval
land
friends
action, of
would tell
course.
us the Shenandoah out in the Pacific, a little further west.
Yeah.
That's a pirate
So,
ship. That's a pirate ship.
pirate ship. Gotcha. So, Phil, let me kind of back up to something that Pat had mentioned about how Canby's getting his regulars stripped and sent to the east, and so he has to bolster his forces with all these volunteers that Pat's been talking about. It seems to me that the federal government in DC doesn't have the same strategic view of the value of the Southwest that the South did. If the South is sort of thinking, empire and mineral wealth and ports, that's super important. And the federal government, meanwhile, is like, maybe it's not that important. What's your take on that?
I mean, here obviously you kind of hit it right there. But my view is that um, Sibley understands a little bit of the dynamics. He is a Louisianan. Um, he understands that I mean the Texans have come across the border into New Mexico to try to establish dominance, and you have this ready-made military frontier culture in Texas as well. Um, you also, I think, you have to look at it as um, they don't know. I mean, there's still gentlemen passing through. Albert Sidney Johnston is passing through the area from his department in the Pacific, and he actually is asked to stay by Baylor a little bit in the first headquarters there to kind of so his first overall command for like 3 days as he waits to go is out there, and so you have these general officers that are going through. They're heading east with these ideas, and so not only is I mean the Federal Army is scattered, so you got to consolidate. Obviously, I mean they need to Lincoln's move on protecting Washington D.C. and so forth. And you also, I mean, I almost feel like you got to stop the bleeding. It's like that Chevy Chase thing in Vegas Vacation where you keep plugging a hole and something else spouts out. You got Missouri and Kentucky, you got Maryland, I mean Virginia, and so forth. And then so the Confederates are a little lucky because um, they can take advantage of this organization. And then you have Sibley walk in this meeting with Jefferson Davis, and basically he gives the answer that every both Lincoln and Davis want to hear. Just give me a brigade command. I will raise the troops. I'll get a few guns out in San Antonio, and I'll be on my way. I mean, every other general officer, I need more troops. I need more this. I need more that. So for the Confederates, you don't. Davis is like, okay, you win something, amazing. If you lose something, what did I really lose? Where I mean, the Federals are trying to, okay, everything we lose gives the Confederates more of a point of reference, saying we are a country, we are should be recognized. Look, we can hold our own. We're fighting for the right to be free, and so forth. And so you almost have nothing to lose if you're the Confederates, which is great because you have a guy named Sibley who um, we'll lose it. I mean, to put it politely. And then you have Canby, who is, I think, underrated and understands some of the logistical side. I mean, although he holds up in Fort Craig, his goal of getting the food and livestock out from in front of Sibley's army is a major underrated value of a officer that knows logistics. And I mean, you see that Canby, I think, is the officer that what accepts the last Confederate army surrender east of the Mississippi. He's also the highest ranking federal commander killed by Native Americans in the war out in the Northwest. And so, I mean, he is a guy who knows his stuff and he will serve long service. But yeah, he's like everyone else asking for troops. Lincoln doesn't have it, where the Confederacy, Sibley's not asking for troops. He's just asking for the commission. So he has the power to raise troops. And I think that's one of the defining differences between the Federals and the Confederates.
Yeah.
I think Phil touched on something that we tried to highlight in the book. It is easy to be a little dismissive of both commanders. Sibley has a deserved reputation as a drunk, and he was not God's gift to the regular army, and he was not God's gift to the Confederate army. But he was a competent professional who had a pretty bold strategic vision, struggled on the execution. But even within the campaign, he's making pretty good decisions with a pretty bad hand. And then Canby is really easily derided as being too slow and too administrative. He's also dealt a pretty bad hand here. And both of them are coming in with very conscious decisions. And so I think something where I think we were trying to stand out from other accounts of the campaign was trying to put the reader in the shoes of, okay, here's the information they have, here's the tools they have, here's why they're making these decisions. even if it is pretty easy to mock, especially Sibley, uh, after the fact.
It is one of those
So let
things
me,
that
can I
oh
just,
yeah, sure,
oh,
go
sorry.
ahead, Phil. No,
I
no.
just want to add one more thing and you see it also played east of the Mississippi, the west of Mississippi. I think Sibley's allowed to make a few more mistakes than Canby because of his subordinate commanders. He's got three excellent initially regimental commanders. It's what William O'Reilly. It's uh, Dirty Shirt Scurry. I always forget William Dirty Shirt Scurry, who's basically canvases Texas to get him to secede and is so adamant about seceding that he forgets to change his shirt. Apparently, that's where he gets his name. And then Colonel Tom Green, who later on is in charge of cavalry under Taylor, yeah, down in Louisiana in the Red River campaign until he overzealously attacks a gunboat and gets his head blown off. But those guys take command of and they're also known, and so they come like Southern officers that you see in the Confederate Army in the initial, where they've used to having some type of command and control, and they're used to having a air about them, and so they do go and do great service and so forth. And you have a young and restless. I think the average age of the Confederate Texan that goes is in their low 20s, and so you have a different type of force that Sibley has a little more error because these are men younger with a little more of a chance to live on the edge and so forth with three very capable regimental commanders that are able to that go on and do great things for the Confederacy in other roles. And so I think that's something that also had to be said that can be as best subordinate officers losing his freaking mind at Fort Union and so forth. And so that's what Canby's dealing with the administration. There's already a black mark with Major Lynn surrendering Fort Fillmore and getting cashiered. And now you have basically the cream of these Texas Rangers, if you want to call them anything less, coming. And the best thing that happens to Canby is that Sibley is either sick and drinking whiskey or he's a drunk that's getting himself sick. And so, and that's also probably the best thing for the Confederates at Valverde and Glorieta that Sibley misses it. So, um, that's an interesting dynamic. I just wanted to put out there to give that props to the men who actually were the regimental commanders that show up and actually on both sides, and Chivington and Slew and all them as well, or Slough. That's where the battles turned with those guys, not with
Yeah, and
Sibley and Canby.
And it is one of those things, and I think this speaks to Pat's point a second ago too, where like when you know what happened, it's easy to kind of criticize and make these comments. But one of the things I think your book does really well is kind of highlights the on the ground challenges that both sides faced as this is unfolding. And Pat, you talked about these guys both being dealt bad hands, and I don't think that we understand kind of the logistics of this campaign the way we do other campaigns, just because of the challenges that the desert offers and the challenges that the distance offers and those sorts of things, and you guys really highlight those real well. I want people to read the book, so I don't want to get into the details of all the battles and all that kind of stuff, but give us Pat, give us just a quick little sketch of like what are the actions that your book is going to cover over the course of this campaign before it finally comes to its conclusion.
So it opens at the First Battle of Messina, and that's going to be in July 1861. That really sets the stage for the Confederate presence in Arizona and New Mexico and opens the door for Sibley's invasion. And then Sibley's 1862 campaign is the heart of the book. I mean, that's the meat of it. It's going to cover the Battle of Valverde, the Battle of Glorieta Pass, Gettysburg of the West, and then a skirmish at Peralta, and then finally the Confederate withdrawal back into Texas.
And it seems to me this is a campaign that maybe Canby doesn't win, but Sibley loses. Am I right in that assessment?
You know, it depends on what you think of as Canby's goal.
Yeah.
So there is a moment where he's basically being accused by his own troops, in part because he's a Kentuckian, of maybe letting Sibley off too easy. And there is some grumbling towards the end of the campaign as everyone is hot and tired and dusty and increasingly hungry in the Union Army of is Canby really trying to win this, or is he happy to just let them go? And Canby pulls one of them aside and says, "You know how hungry you are right now. Imagine if we had to feed their army too." And so I don't know that Canby doesn't achieve exactly what he sets out to, which is survive, keep his force intact, defend the territory, and have intact units that once the campaign's over, he can and does send east.
Mhm. And Phil, what's your assessment?
I mean, the most pivotal, I mean, building on what Pat just said, the most pivotal moment of the Gettysburg West is when Chivington, with his New Mexican guide, hits the wagon train of Scurry's forces there. I mean, because Scurry's pushing, and it looks like they're going to break through the line, or at least have this climatic last attempt to do so. And so, I mean, the Adages Phil history about, I mean, Lee's army surrenders in 1865 because they can't eat. Napoleon says it in his marches. His army marches or fights on its stomach, and so that is the main goal. I mean, I almost think that Canby can win it by not losing. Um,
Okay.
he can hold up in Fort Craig. That's something in the path. So Sibley needs to keep moving, and he needs to keep his because he needs to provide supplies, or he's going to have this tenuous supply line that's going to run past federal held forts. So that's untenable, and so he's got to keep moving and Canby recognizes that by moving stuff out in front of him. He's got to keep searching, and then he's got to spread his forces out, and so forth. And so, yeah, it is. On all those men are younger and supposed to be more adept to hardships. They're human, and they got to eat, and that's the problem. And then being mounted, and some of the neat stories about how Canby, some of his energetic younger officers, fight that and so forth. That's the thing. Yeah, Canby is playing almost like Canby's playing chess when a lot of these militia and the soldiers think he should be playing checkers.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Pat, let me ask you, we talked about the stakes of this campaign being high. If Sibley is successful, the war looks a lot differently. So, what are the ramifications then of Sibley not carrying out his conquest for empire here?
It denies the Confederates a few different things that would have been really valuable for them. So Phil mentioned just how much gold was at stake, and the Confederacy is uh, bankrupt virtually from the beginning. Uh, they're borrowing money to the extent they can. Mostly they're funding the war on a hope and a prayer at best. Getting that much absolute, actual hard currency would have been a game changer for the Confederate economy and war effort. It, and then if they had been able to successfully get a California port, it gets them around the blockade a little bit, though that's a tenuous route. But getting around the blockade at all, even notionally, might have changed European views on recognition. Is this a real blockade? Because a blockade has to be absolute for it to count under what was considered international law at the time. And then just the amount of territory that's up for grabs, you have to wonder how much does that impact foreign recognition and how much does it impact the domestic politics? If this offensive were sustained into the fall of 1862, now what are we talking about in terms of elections? And it would have forced federal troops to be sent in reinforcement. At one point, Halleck in St. Louis tells 5,000 guys, you've got to march to Colorado and get ready to defend Denver and drive Sibley back. You take 5,000 Union troops out of the early 1862 campaigns in the Mississippi Valley. That's a wild what if. We can't begin to answer it, but it highlights just how big the dominoes were that could have started falling.
Yeah, yeah. And Phil, knowing how big these stakes are, like the campaign's over, and then there's no attempt to reignite the campaign. There's no 1863 or 1864 New Mexico campaign. Why not?
Well, first of all, yeah, it's I think it's the Paris Agreement or whatever, 1857 about the port. Um, but
Yeah.
it ruins. There's a great sign at Glorieta Pass. I think that shows the death knell of what the 1862 campaign was. It was a Confederate attempt at manifest destiny, and they failed. And the officers go east. The manpower is pulled. Now there are attempts and efforts. Baylor, I think, will continue to argue for something, but as tensions get drawn to the Mississippi River, you get resources pulled elsewhere. Sibley is cashiered for being a drunk or is asked to leave Taylor's army. I just want to give a caveat that Sibley can find alcohol anywhere, including Egypt, which we have to give him some credit for. Um, but the resources pulled east, but to the point where um, one of the other interesting tidbits, if you've ever read Donald Fraser's The Quadrille History of like the Trans-Mississippi along the 1862 3-4, he mentions the Arizona regiments, the first and second Confederate Arizona. So troops even like that have been pulled for where the Confederacy more needs them. There's also that tenuous supply. I mean, there's not much between San Antonio and so forth and Fort Davis and El Paso and all that. So you tried it. I mean, the soldiers that returned to San Antonio are spreading how tough it was and how troublesome and how hungry and thirsty. And these are the young 20-some-year-olds who are saying that. So it is tough. But I mean, the what ifs are just what historians love to talk about is the what ifs and everything like that. And this campaign has it all. I mean, what if? It's just kind of interesting.
So the book is Desert Empire, the 1862 New Mexico campaign. As we head into the final stretch here, I'll give you each the chance to pitch one last word or thought you want to share. Phill, let me start with you as the veteran. Any final thoughts you want to share with us tonight?
It's I kind of just shared at the end of what the manifest destinies. That's what's really stuck into me reading that sign, and that's what really provoked and everything. And it is just amazing. And it's one of those. I know we harp on it a lot about you have to get on the ground, but I think you really have to get on the ground to appreciate um, how widespread this was, how interesting it was, and also how kind of American, whether you lean on North or South, how much this played into what would be later the Wild Wild West and the chances of a really big powder keg and changing the entire scope of the Southwest of the United States. Um, and there's a lot of good drinking holes, so you can be like Sibley if you want to.
I really like that idea, though. Yeah, of course, I'm always a big favor of having boots on the ground, but this is one of those areas of the country that's just so vastly different than anything that you're used to on the eastern or western battlefields, and so kind of being out there helps you appreciate just how different this campaign is than most of what we're used to.
Tough and
Um,
durable you got to be
yeah,
just to yeah to drive through it,
yeah,
much
right.
less fight through it.
Pat, any final thoughts?
Yeah, riffing on what Phil said, this campaign is a little bit of a cautionary tale about the importance of battlefield preservation. So, Valverde is one of the largest battles. It's complicated. A lot of it is privately owned. It's a Ted Turner ranch. He's allowed some historians on, and some historians in the area have a good relationship with him, but it's not publicly accessible in the way that most Eastern battlefields are. Glorieta is the best preserved, but a lot of that was paved over when I-25 went through Glorieta Pass. And so huge portions of that battlefield are under a highway now. And then Peralta is a little bit underrated even within the campaign for its importance. And that's completely paved over. I don't think there's even an historic marker saying Peralta happened here. I think the heart of the fighting is at Rite Aid now. Nothing against Rite Aid, but this is probably the least preserved camp set of battlefields of any campaign I can think of.
Wow. Wow. That's saying
Uh,
something too. I can see, yeah. Wow.
yeah, I mean, you're in Northern Virginia, and
Uh,
I know how y'all talk about the development, and I go out there and I think this is immaculate. What are you talking about? Not really, but it does. What is preserved is fantastic. There's this spot just outside of Fort Craig where you can stand and you have this panorama. And from one spot, you can see what was days and days of maneuvering in the run up to and then aftermath of Valverde. And that is just, and you're standing on a ridge and you can see to the horizon in every direction. And I can't think of any other campaign where you can stand in one spot and be able to look at all of that.
Yeah. Wow. Wow.
Let
So
me, I just want to add one little thing
yeah, please.
to the end. And if you think you're not on the battlefield, just look around. You'll find the ubiquitous Texas marker for their military soldiers. So there
Yeah.
is one at Valverde. So if you want it, you cannot go to New Mexico and not have the same monument that sits at Antietam and Gettysburg and every Eastern battle. So yeah, there is one thing that will make you feel at home, even in New Mexico.
Well, Phil, Pat, congratulations on your book. I'm looking forward to seeing it on my bookshelf. So
Thank you, Chris.
I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.